We have now received a trove of new information. It includes details on what Betsy Hackman was searching for before she died in the first-person view of the officers. The federal forensics team stepped through the concealed doorway behind Gene Hackman's private library and began the long descent into the bedrock, 40 feet down past the poured concrete and the steel beams from the 1950s. The tunnel changed, and what was waiting at the bottom was not supposed to exist. Not under this estate, not under any private estate in America. Within hours of the first report reaching Central Command, the entire case was pulled out of public view and classified. The story no one questioned. When Gene Hackman was found dead at his $4 million Santa Fe estate, the official explanation felt like it wrote itself. He was 95 years old. His wife Betsy Arakawa had already passed. An elderly man isolated in grief, withdrawing from the world until his body simply gave out. Additionally, there were no autopsy findings concerning for hantavirus infection. Betsy's cause of death was attributed to a severe viral infection. High virus genes was listed as heart failure, with Alzheimer's as a contributing factor. The narrative was clean. The narrative was human. The narrative was wrong. For most people, even the appearance of federal agents at the estate barely registered. Police body camera footage showed deputies finding 65-year-old Arakawa dead in a bathroom. 95-year-old Hackman was found dead near the kitchen close to the front door. As we know, both individuals tested negative for carbon monoxide. The FBI response was chalked up to standard protocol when high-profile estates change hands unexpectedly. The heavy steel gates, the motion sensors ringing the property, the thermal cameras along the perimeter walls. These were the expected eccentricities of a Hollywood legend who had spent decades fending off paparazzi. The non-disclosure agreements, legally imposed on every employee of the estate. Reasonable, private, understandable. And that's exactly what made it so effective as a cover story. Here's the thing. The estate was never really a celebrity retreat. Behind those solid stone walls hidden entirely from the region's main road network, Hackman hadn't withdrawn from the world. He had been doing something in there, something he had kept doing quietly for the last 2 decades of his life. And when the federal forensics team finally walked through the front door, the first thing they noticed was that the scene inside didn't look like grief. It looked like someone had been managing it. 7 days of silence. Medical investigators believe the couple died about a week apart. Arakawa first, Hackman 7 days later, 7 full days. 7 days during which the estate's entire telecommunication system recorded 0 outgoing calls, no emergency services. With what the investigation found, possibly as shocking as the announcement of the deaths themselves, one finding was that Hackman had Alzheimer's and possibly did not know his wife had been dead for a week. No family, no medical contact of any kind. For 7 days, 95-year-old man with documented heart disease sat alone in a sealed compound with his wife's body and never once reached for the phone. And here's where it stops being explainable as grief. Investigators pulled the central security server data from the ground floor. What they found wasn't the disorganized record of a man overwhelmed by loss. The bedroom furniture had been dragged from its original positions. Personal safes had been forced open, and on the very day Betsy died, Gene Hackman had manually entered the code to disable every single internal surveillance camera in the estate while simultaneously keeping the outer perimeter alarms locked at maximum sensitivity. Stop and think about what that means. That configuration isn't panic. That's architecture. Deliberate blinding of one system and the calculated preservation of another. An arrangement made by someone who understood exactly what they were doing, exactly what they needed to conceal. Behavioral analysts brought in to review the security data were unambiguous. This was not emotional disorientation. This was the unmistakable signature of a deliberate containment process. Blind the inside, harden the outside by time. And the question nobody on that team could shake was this. Buy time for what? What does a 95-year-old man with a failing heart spend his last 7 days on Earth so carefully protecting that he won't even call for help when his wife stops breathing? That answer was sitting 40 feet below his library floor. They just didn't know it yet. What the scan found, the inconsistencies forced federal agents to go deeper, literally. They brought in LiDAR, the same tech archaeologists used to find lost cities under jungle canopy. They pointed it straight down through Gene Hackman's floor. And get this, on the very first scan pass, the system flagged a deep temperature anomaly dropping down through dozens of meters of solid New Mexico bedrock. The void started behind the wall of Hackman's private library and just kept going. Think about that for a second. The library was the room where in his final years Hackman spent most of his waking hours. Every piece of photography of the man in retirement, every account from the handful of employees who ever saw him placed him in that library alone reading supposedly. And the whole time the wall behind his chair was hiding a void that ran straight down into the bedrock. Agents cross-referenced it against the county's civil planning records. Nothing. The structure the LiDAR had just mapped in, three-dimensional detail, did not appear in any public record on file anywhere. It had never been registered. It had never been disclosed. It didn't officially exist. This is where it gets strange. The entrance to the thing was hidden behind a bookshelf in Hackman's library. As for the inside footage, Hackman's estate wants to block that release, citing privacy. A judge will determine that. But the mechanism that secured it wasn't electronic. No biometric scanner, no keypad, no wireless signal of any kind. What locked that passage was an old-school mechanical system embedded into wood and steel. Solid bolts, precise sequence of physical actions. You had to know it. You had to perform it. And you had to have the strength to throw those bolts by hand. Think about that for a second. 95 years old heart, failing Alzheimer's listed as a contributing factor. And this is the system he had to operate alone every time he wanted to go down there. Agents stepped through the entrance and descended. The tunnel's upper section, nearest the surface, was reinforced with poured concrete and steel beams. Dr. Marcus Elford, a structural engineer, attached to the federal forensic response team, examined the rivet spacing and went quiet for several seconds. Then he told the lead investigator that the pour method and rivet configuration matched military-grade security construction standards from the 1950s. Exactly. In 30 years of structural assessment, he said he had only seen that specific configuration in 2 other places. Both were classified federal installations. But at 40 feet down, everything changed. The industrial concrete stopped. The steel beams disappeared. What replaced them were rough stone walls carved with thousands of primitive tool marks. The hand-carved core of this tunnel wasn't modern. It was ancient, carved by human hands long before the 1950s upper section was built over it. Long before the estate above it existed, long before Hackman. It wasn't a bunker. It was something older that someone had reinforced, militarized, and buried, and Gene Hackman had been walking down into it. If you've been following this investigation from the beginning, you already know that what gets found at the bottom of that tunnel is the detail that changes everything. What the federal team was about to discover, and what the DNA analysis would confirm about the biological conditions inside it, triggered a classification response that locked down this entire case within hours. If that's the kind of story you want to stay ahead of, subscribe now and hit the bell, because what comes next is the part they didn't want documented, what the DNA showed. Then the microforensic results came back, and the entire death investigation shifted direction. Special forensic technician Raymond Voss, attached to the federal evidence team out of the Albuquerque field office, was the first analyst to examine the gears of the library locking mechanism under magnification. He had been told to look for anything inconsistent with long-term disuse, something that would confirm the tunnel had been abandoned for decades, which was the working assumption the moment the door was found. That is not what he saw through the eyepiece. What he saw made him lift his eye from the scope, pause, then lift it again to make sure he was reading the surface correctly. He set down his tools. He walked out of the lab, and he called his supervisor before he wrote a single word in his report. "We do." Officials believe that he most likely died of dehydration and starvation. The Australian company Kelpie Mix named Xena was found near Betts's body in a crate. One of the other technicians in the room later described it as the quietest he'd ever seen Voss on the job. The metallic abrasion marks on the interior gears were fresh. Not months old, not years old, days old, aligning with forensic precision to the 7-day window between Betsy Arakawa's death and Gene Hackman's. Here's what that means. A 95-year-old man, in the final stages of cardiac decline, had not spent his last days in bed. He had descended those stone steps. He had thrown those heavy mechanical bolts. He had gone down into the cold dark at some point during those 7 final days and climbed back up before his heart finally gave out. But it was the DNA analysis from deeper inside the tunnel that pulled the whole case out of standard channels. The genetic material recovered from the deepest sections of the chamber indicated exposure to biological conditions that should not exist in an isolated subterranean space beneath a private estate in Santa Fe. What the DNA actually identified has not been released publicly. What has been confirmed through sources close to the initial forensic team is this. The findings triggered an immediate escalation of the federal response. The case was routed through classification protocols typically reserved for matters of active national security infrastructure. Not historical curiosity, active ongoing concern. The organic material in that chamber had no innocent explanation. Something biological, something that produced recoverable DNA trace evidence had been active in that space. And the people with authority to classify it decided within hours that the public did not need to know what it was. So here's the question that should be keeping you up. What exactly had Gene Hackman been feeding it? A timeline that won't hold. Here's the catch. The DNA findings didn't exist in isolation. Stack the evidence in order. Betsy dies. That same day, Gene disables every internal surveillance camera in the estate and locks the outer alarms to maximum. 7 days pass with zero contact to the outside world. Raymond Voss's microforensic analysis confirms the mechanical locks were operated during that window, and the DNA from the deepest point of the chamber confirms biological activity that had no business being there. Each data point taken alone could be waved away. A man disabling his cameras in the first hours of grief. An elderly man disoriented going downstairs he shouldn't have. Down. Contamination from decades of human contact in that week, looking at CCTV, looking at phone records. But this virus that they say Betsy Arakawa contracted, Hunter virus, they say is something they do see several times a year. But stacked on top of each other, the excuses collapse because they all point the same way toward a man who in the last week of his life with a failing heart was performing specific tasks in a specific order. Not randomly, not emotionally, with the methodical precision of someone executing a protocol he had performed many times before. This is the detail nobody in the initial press coverage caught. The federal response itself confirmed it. When investigators arrive at the scene of a confused old man's accidental death, they don't immediately classify the forensic findings. They don't deploy signal shielding equipment under cover of night. They don't issue national security holds on municipal complaint records from 2019. The speed of that response tells you more than any press release ever will. And get this, the DNA wasn't the only biological anomaly flagged from the chamber. Atmospheric samples from the deepest section registered chemical compounds associated with organic metabolic processes, not ancient residue, not offing from the rock, not active compounds, produced by living biological systems, sealed into the same 12-hour classification window as the DNA. And here's what broke the room. And here's what. When the investigation team moved toward the far wall of the chamber, they realized the whole time they'd been down there, something had been listening back. Inside the chamber, step into the chamber with them. The natural stone floor had been deliberately leveled. Its surface was engraved with a complex system of astronomical coordinates, a precise mapping of planetary orbits, implying mathematical knowledge completely inconsistent with anything you'd expect in a private cave under a retired actor's house. Wooden crates scattered across the floor held metallurgical components of unknown origin, many cast as single solid pieces with no welding seams, a manufacturing method with no precedent in documented early 20th century industrial metalwork. But none of that was what stopped the room. Embedded along the rough stone wall secured with corrosion-resistant brackets was a closed-circuit communication system. A thick coaxial cable insulated with dense industrial rubber penetrated the wall above and cut upward through dozens of meters of bedrock before terminating in the heart of the chamber. Electrical systems analyst Dr. Claire Souza, on secondment from a federal infrastructure assessment unit, was brought in to evaluate the circuit. She took one look, traced the power source, and found a localized alkaline battery array operating completely independently of the estate's electrical grid above. Sized to run without interruption, even during a total surface power failure, she actually stepped back from it. Told colleagues later, it was one of the most deliberate pieces of electrical infrastructure she had ever assessed outside of a classified facility. Someone, she said, authorities have said that they don't know if Gene Hackman was fully aware his wife had died in the week between her death and his. But if he did want to get help, his daughters told police he did not know how to use a cell phone, had wanted this system to keep running no matter what happened to the house above it. The casing was clean maintained. Someone had been down here regularly wiping the humidity off the connectors. And here's what broke her concentration entirely. When she dismantled the connectors to examine the interior, she found no microphone, no speaker, no mechanism for voice communication in either direction. The cable terminated in a large mechanical signal transducer. Its sole function was to be pressed against solid surfaces and pick up extremely low frequency vibrations. Tiny pressure fluctuations, subtle movements traveling through dense stone. Those signals were transmitted up through the buried cable straight to a concealed monitoring speaker inside Gene Hackman's private living quarters above. Picture it. For years, possibly for the last 2 decades of his life, Hackman wasn't just living in that estate. He was stationed there listening not to voices, not to broadcasts, not to the outside world, listening to the vibrations of something pressing against the far side of a sealed wall 40 feet below his bedroom floor. Think about the shape of his days, the late-night walks through the estate that neighbors occasionally glimpsed, the library lights on at odd hours, the refusal to leave the property even for brief travel in the last 2 years of his life. At the time, the public read it as the stubborn routine of an aging man retreating into himself. It wasn't. It was a man on watch. The listening never stopped, and the cable was still transmitting the night his heart stopped. The door that won't open. At the terminal end of that analog cable, bonded with industrial epoxy to the deepest structure of the chamber, where the cavern narrowed into an unnatural constriction, there was a door, a massive iron door, not modern ballistic material. Carbon steel, weathered by considerable age, completely flat, no external handle, no mechanical lock, no keypad, no visible hinges on either face. Every seam along its perimeter, every point where this door met the natural stone frame surrounding it, had been sealed with continuous weld lines, unbroken permanent applied entirely from the exterior. This is the detail that broke the investigative framework. A bunker door is built to protect the people inside from intrusion. The handle, the bolt, the hinges, the lock, all of it exists, so the people inside can open it, can exit, can control their own barrier. but a door welded permanently shut from the outside. It's not uncommon to find someone down on the floor as part of a terminal collapse, so to speak. And that may very well have been what happened to Miss Hackman. With no mechanism on either face follows a completely different logic. It is not a door built to protect. It is a door built to contain, to ensure that whatever is on the other side stays there permanently, unconditionally. And the moment that detail reached the federal investigators, the entire story of the estate above them flipped inside out. The towering stone walls, the confidentiality agreements that erased every employee from public record, the isolation from surrounding roads and utilities. Hackman disabling his own cameras in the hours after his wife died. None of that was the privacy of a famous man tired of being watched. He wasn't protecting himself from the world. He was protecting the world from whatever was behind that door. And he had been doing it alone for decades from a house built on top of it. This is the angle the story has been hiding the entire time. Gene Hackman wasn't a victim. He wasn't a recluse. He was a civilian warden. The only man standing between something sealed under the Santa Fe desert and the rest of us. The federal specialists stood before that rusted door with plasma-cutting equipment on site. Industrial-grade tools capable of breaching any steel structure within minutes. Not a single agent present was authorized to activate it. They analyzed the weld lines. They documented the astronomical star map carved into the floor. And they made one decision. Everything stays sealed. They refused to open what one man had spent his entire life keeping closed. Which raises the question nobody in that chamber wanted to say out loud. If the federal government wasn't authorized to open it, who originally authorized Gene Hackman to guard it? The lockdown. The moment the technical reports on the welded door, the listening cable, and the classified DNA findings reached Central Command evidence collection at the site was halted. A total information lockdown rolled out across the property. No forensic documentation released to the press. Local reporters turned back at the perimeter by military police. Ownership of the surrounding forest land, placed under special government control, justified under urgent national security provisions. Every Freedom of Information Act request seeking the structural plans of the site, denied under the highest available classification protocols. This is the detail that should stop you cold. And then the data eraser was discovered. Independent investigators trying to pull municipal records found that resident complaints filed between 2019 and the present. Reports submitted by people living several miles from the estate had been systematically deleted from every state database accessible to civilians. Those complaints had described a recurring low-frequency mechanical vibration coming from underground. Body cam footage has been released from the response to the deaths of actor Gene Hackman and his wife Betsy Araba. Regular approximately 2 in the morning. Civilian seismic sensors had recorded the disturbances. Local authorities had dismissed them in writing as plumbing and heating infrastructure. Those records no longer exist in any state system. And get this, the unmarked military transport convoys that arrived at the estate under cover of night carried signal shielding technology. Their movement didn't look like a research operation. It didn't look like a standard federal forensics response. It looked like the rotation of a risk management apparatus that had been in place in some form for a very long time. Stop and think about what that means. They weren't responding as if to a new discovery. They moved to reclaim it as an existing asset. One they had apparently allowed a single civilian to maintain finance and guard at his own expense for decades while they stayed invisible in the background. Only when the last watchman finally collapsed did they step out of the shadows to take back what they had always been watching over and stop and sit with what that means about Gene Hackman himself. Every movie premiere he attended in the 1990s, every red carpet interview, every quiet retirement dinner in Santa Fe, he was already carrying this. He went home from all of it, to a house on top of a sealed door, and he listened. The version of Hackman the public remembers was the performance. The real job had always been the one no one knew he had. And here's what nobody in the initial coverage stopped to ask. If Gene Hackman had been acting alone, if this was just the private obsession, of an eccentric old man. Why did the federal government have a classified response protocol already in place? Why were plasma cutting teams pre-authorized to be on site but prohibited from using their equipment? Why was a Freedom of Information Act denial issued within hours of the first requests, under a classification level that requires sign-off from a clearance chain that does not act on short notice? That's not a government discovering something unexpected. That's a government managing a known situation that had just become public. And the man who knew the most about it had been silent for 7 days straight before they ever found his body. His last 7 days now put it all together. The microforensic evidence, the signal transmission data, the classified DNA, the sealed welded door, Gene Hackman's silence. During the 7 days following Betsy's death, stops being explainable as grief or shock or psychological collapse. It was a security protocol executed to its absolute limit by a man who understood precisely what failure would cost. The moment Betsy took her last breath, Hackman's failing heart was hit with an unforgiving calculation. One emergency call. That's all it would take. Local police, EMTs, forensic teams, media, people with no knowledge of the containment protocols, no awareness of the tunnel, no understanding of what was sealed 40 feet below the library floor. They would move through the corridors, they would search the rooms, they would reach the bookshelf, and ordinary human curiosity. Within the last hour, the authorities in Los Angeles have been giving more details about their investigation into the deaths of the actor Gene Hackman and his wife Betsy Arakawa. Just investigators doing their jobs could have disrupted the mechanical locking sequence, interrupted the signal line, or drawn direct attention to the iron door. So he made a choice. He disabled the internal surveillance cameras, ensuring no record of his final movements could be recovered. He descended those stone steps one last time. He operated the heavy mechanical locks, verifying the containment remained intact. He returned to the surface, and inside the sealed silent house with the monitoring speaker in his private quarters still transmitting the low-frequency rhythm from the bedrock below. He sat down, and he listened until his own heartbeat finally stopped. The incident in Santa Fe was closed without public explanation. The anomalous engineering, the astronomical coordinates, the classified DNA, the active analog monitoring circuit. None of it was ever going to be resolved through a standard investigation. It was managed, transferred, buried a second time. This time, under classification protocols, instead of bedrock control, passed from the trembling hands of one aging civilian into the silent, calculated machinery of a government apparatus that had apparently never walked away. The agents withdrew. The LiDAR systems were packed up and removed. The estate disappeared from accessible public record. Beneath the bedrock, the corroded iron door is still there, its weld still unbroken, its seal intact. And far below the Santa Fe desert, that low-frequency vibration continues its mechanical rhythm, exactly as it did when Gene Hackman was alive to hear it. Whatever he spent a lifetime listening to is still there. Only the one who listens has been replaced. So here's the question that should keep you up tonight. If Gene Hackman spent the last 2 decades of his life quietly without recognition or reward, without a single person in his life knowing about it, guarding a door welded shut from the outside, and if the government already had a classified protocol ready and waiting the moment he finally died alone in that house who chose him for that job, and what does it mean that the watch is still being kept? Drop your theory in the comments. And if this story raised more questions than it answered, it should. Subscribe for more investigations that go where the official record stops.